Russia occupies 1/6 of the land surface of the earth. From the Arctic snows to the hot sands of Central Asia, from Vladivostok, an oriental port on the Pacific Ocean, to St. Petersburg and Moscow, the Tsar's great capitals in modern Europe. Nicholas II, by the grace of God, Emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. He announced upon ascending the throne that he would preserve the principle of autocracy firmly and immutably. In her summer palace at Livadia, the Tsarina is receiving gifts from the captains of the guard on her birthday. The royal family, the Tsar, the Tsarina, the Tsarevich, and the 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. A large part of the Tsar's official life consisted of religious ceremonies. The heads of the Greek Orthodox Church were the Tsar's chief aid in preserving the principle of autocracy. The Tsar supported the church with money, and the church taught the people to worship the Tsar. But the Tsar was dominated by the Tsarina, a beautiful but extremely superstitious woman. The Tsarevich, heir to the throne, was afflicted with hemophilia, a disease frequent among the royal families of Europe. It is said that the ignorant Siberian priest and horse thief Rasputin was able to stop the boy's blood flow by hypnotic suggestion, and that this was the reason for his uncanny dominion over the Tsarina, the Tsar, the royal family, and hence over all Russia during the years preceding the revolution. The Tsarevich was probably the best spoiled child in the world. Another member of the royal family, the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, commander-in-chief of the armies during the World War. He was 7 feet tall, handsome, and imposing. He would have been the Tsar if this were a fairy story. Real Tsars are not so imposing. These pictures of the private life of the court and the royal family, taken with the Tsar's own camera, were found in his chambers in the Winter Palace when it was captured by the Bolsheviks in the October Revolution. A Russian conception of the World Series. challenging them to a game of tag, and they daren't take after him. One kind of fun that a Tsar can't have. But he can take off his royal togs and go swimming like a regular human being. As Will Rogers told us, there is not a bathing suit in Russia. His Majesty is on the left. His Majesty is still on the left. This is the first time the world ever saw a king as he really is. With a small group of old generals and bureaucrats, the Tsar ruled an absolute despot over all Russia. Next to him stood the great landowning nobility. Their estates were sometimes as big as Connecticut or Massachusetts. Their gay and picturesque lives seemed to belong to an eternal scheme. They are celebrating a wedding in the landlord's family. Of the nobility, Prince Peter Kropotkin, famous anarchist, foretold the storm to come. Next to the landowning nobility stood the bourgeois class of merchants and capitalists. Beneath the landlords and capitalists, and remote from the Tsar as though in a different world, the vast mass of the people lived in ignorance, toil, and extreme poverty. The gulf between rich and poor was never wider than in Tsarist Russia. Hating this inequality and the Tsar's despotism, thousands of revolutionists had been fighting for a century to overthrow Tsarism and establish a new kind of human society. Catherine Breshkovskaya, little grandmother of the revolution, abandoned wealth, nobility, an adoring husband, and her own baby to give her life to the struggle against Tsarism. But the Tsar had many able defenders against revolution. The Cossacks were loyal and fierce. The royal bodyguard and the savage division, composed of gigantic Caucasian natives, could be relied on for the last drop of their blood. Nothing seemed more secure than the Tsar's despotism. And yet, these are the last pictures of the family of Nicholas Romanov, taken in the late autumn of 1916. 18 months later, all 7 of them were shot in a cellar in Yekaterinburg. The Tsar had an army of 4 million peasants. The Kaiser also had soldiers to play with. The Kaiser enjoys the war game for the last time in 1913. "1914, the real thing." Armies were soon defeated by the superior organization and equipment of the Germans. By the end of 1916, their retreat had become a national disaster. The soldiers were being herded into battle, hungry, ill-clad, without enough ammunition, even without guns. Corruption, treachery, neglect, profiteering had ruined the Tsar's military organization. 2.5 million killed, 5 million wounded. They were lying like piles of rubbish outside the hospitals, too crowded to contain them. Wounded and dying and with no clothes on their backs. 2.5 million dead, and no time to bury them. The bodies of the peasants who had tilled the Russian soil for the Tsar and the landlords were dumped out like manure in the frozen fields. The Tsar removed the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich and assumed the title of Commander-in-Chief. He arrives at the front, accompanied by the Chief of Staff Yanushkevich and the deposed Grand Duke. General Alexeyev delivers a report. Military experience consisted of praying with the army for victory and sprinkling the soldiers with holy water to make them fight better. The soldiers did not want parades and ceremonies, but generalship, food, ammunition, clothing. At home, too, the people were starving. Old men, women, and cripples were tilling the fields. Women were standing all day in bread lines. In the empty markets, the crowd stood desperate. Workers abandoned the factories and held demonstrations in defiance of the police. They began to march in groups, singing revolutionary songs, carrying banners, peace, bread, liberty. The Tsar's answer: I forbid all meetings in the streets. I warn the people that the soldiers have been instructed to use their rifles to restore order in the capital. The crowds increased. The street meetings continued. And for the first time in history, the Tsar's soldiers failed him. Instead of using their rifles to restore order, they completed the disorder by joining the people in the streets. Revolt and the Tsar's armed forces are united. The autocracy is doomed. The Duma, or Parliament, met in the Tauride Palace. It was dissolved by order of the Tsar, but in great fright and excitement decided to remain in the capital. The people in revolution surrounded the palace. In the left wing of the palace, a group of revolutionists issued a leaflet summoning all factories and regiments to elect deputies to a council or Soviet of workers and soldiers. Within 12 hours, the Soviet was elected and assembled. The next day, 4 regiments of the Garrett mutinied and marched to the Tauride Palace to defend the revolution. The welcome at the palace. Rodzianko, president of the Duma, telegraphed the Czar. Anarchy in the capital. Someone trusted by the people must be appointed to form a new government. The Czar to his minister of the court, Frederick. That silly ass, Rodzianko, has sent me some more nonsense, which I won't even bother to answer. At the command of the Soviet, detachments of soldiers went out to arrest the Tsar's ministers. Other detachments enjoyed a glass of tea in the Tauride Palace. Schlüsselburg prison, the old rotting place of the heroes of the revolution, was burnt to the ground. Millions of civil records and deeds were destroyed. Tsarist emblems were torn down everywhere, all over Russia. While the red flag was flying over the capital, the Tsar telegraphed the Tsarina, "Wonderful weather. Hope you are well and calm. Many troops sent from the front. With kind love, Nicky." The many troops obeyed their officers until they reached Petrograd, and there joined the people in the streets. Soldiers no longer, but armed peasants demanding the rights of citizens. You see here in the main thoroughfare of Petrograd the moving body of the power that overthrew the Tsarist autocracy and initiated those events which have altered the whole course of modern history. Rights of citizens is the slogan inscribed upon their banner. 2 loyal members of the Duma went to the front to demand that the Tsar abdicate in favor of his feeble son. Shulgin of the old aristocracy and Guchkov, a representative of big business. The Tsar's abdication. As we do not wish to be separated from our dear son, we transmit the throne to our dear brother, the Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. May the Lord God help Russia. But the Grand Duke Michael had seen the streets of Petrograd. He abdicated the next morning without waiting for a stenographer. The Tsar's immediate successor was the people of Russia, who ceased all business and lived in the streets as on a perpetual holiday. There was no government. Joy was the sovereign of all Russia. They opened the jails and liberated the prisoners. Watch for the little Zulik with white side whiskers. He is coming back and he wanted you to see him. The banner reads, "No more criminals." To make it absolutely sure, the officer of the Soviet gives them a lecture on the principles of democracy. and the news of the revolution arrives among the soldiers in the trenches. The funeral of the martyrs of the February Revolution was not a funeral, but a gigantic, triumphal march of the people. In this momentous upheaval which overthrew a despotism and democratized the government of an empire, only a few hundred men and women lost their lives. Over 1 million people from early morning to dark marched past the one big grave on Mars Field. The banners read, "From darkness to light, eternal memory to the heroes fallen for liberty. Long live the democratic republic." Nothing comparable to these crowds was ever before seen in Europe, said Buchanan, the British ambassador. Troops of happy exiles were returning from Siberia. Vera Zasulich, who shot the Tsar's chief of police, Trepov, in 1878, attends the funeral. Vera Figner, another world-famous revolutionary assassin, attends the funeral. The Duma was there, Rodzianko and Guchkov in their midst. Another individual prominent in the Duma, Paul Milyukov, professor of history. The Soviet of Workers and Soldiers deputies attended the funeral in a body. Skobelyev, a Menshevik or moderate socialist, a figure in the Soviet. Tsereteli, the Menshevik leader of the Soviet. A red militia was organized. Officers returned to their regiments and made speeches about liberty and democracy. The speaker is Purishkevich, head of the Tsarist Black Hundred, one of the slayers of Rasputin. Everybody who has an ideal inscribes it on a banner, hires a brass band, and demands that it be realized by the new government being born in the Taurid Palace. But the government born in the Taurid Palace turns out to be twins. In the right wing, a group of Duma members led by Paul Milyukov declare themselves a provisional government. In the left wing, the Soviet, under the presidency of the socialist Chaidze, elects an executive committee which actually directs the revolution. The prime minister of the provisional government was the genial Prince Lvov, who above all things hated excitement. The foreign minister and real boss of the government was Paul Milyukov, historian. The chairman of the Soviet was also a kindly figurehead, the old eagle Chaidze. Sometimes they called him Little Papa Chaidze. The real boss of the Soviet was the Menshevik socialist Tsereteli. His close supporter Avksentiev, Kamenev, a mild Bolshevik, also supported him for a while, and Schreider, the new mayor of Petrograd. A group of the leaders of the February Revolution. The provisional government of landlords and capitalists wanted to restore order, defend private property, and win the war. The soldiers and workers in the Soviet wanted to stop the war, confiscate the landlords' estates, and have bread, peace, and liberty. A government demonstration, war to complete victory. A Soviet demonstration, land and liberty, long live the International. One man thought he could solve the problem by joining both governments. Alexander Kerensky. Vice President of the Soviet and Minister of Justice in Milyukov's cabinet. The famous old revolutionist Plekhanov, returning from exile in Switzerland, supported Kerensky. Plekhanov was the translator of Karl Marx, the founder of Russian socialism. Another old revolutionist, Burtsev, supported Kerensky. Viktor Chernov, leader of 1 million peasants, supported Kerensky. Kerensky became an idol of the masses. Ladies of leisure pelted him with flowers. Kerensky arrives at a meeting of the Soviet with a bouquet. His portraits were carried like sacred images in the streets, forward with our leader, Kerensky. He soon combined the liberals with the heads of the Soviet in a coalition government and called himself Minister-President Kerensky. But he could not combine land and liberty with war to complete victory, and he chose war to complete victory. The landlords and capitalists applauded. The heads of the Soviet consented. But the revolutionary workers and soldiers flocked to a new and more powerful leader, Lênin. Kerensky is a tool of the landlords and capitalists. Stop the war. Confiscate the land. Russia belongs to the workers and peasants. All power to the Soviets. Lenin's program of proletarian revolution against the Kerensky government was expounded to the masses on the socialist holiday May 1st, 1917 by the best orators of the Bolshevik Party. The first May Day ever celebrated by socialists with power. Kamenev is expounding, as yet without extreme conviction, Lenin's demand for a second revolution. But at that very moment, another great revolutionist was arriving from a small upstairs apartment in the Bronx, New York City, Leon Trotsky. Kerensky is a tool of the landlords and capitalists. Stop the war. Confiscate the land. Russia belongs to the workers and peasants. All power to the Soviets. Against these odds, Kerensky was trying to restore the morale of the army. Officers are learning to cheer the new standard for liberty and fatherland. Manufacturing morale. On June 18th, Kerensky ordered the army to renew the war against Germany. The women's battalion was enthusiastic. Mrs. Pankhurst, British suffragette touring Russia to promote the war spirit, was doubly enthusiastic. But the workers protested with riots in the streets. Battalions of workers armed and drilled by the Bolsheviks threatened the government like an army. Kerensky arrested and disarmed the Workers' Guard, jailed Trotsky, and declared Lênin, who went into hiding, a state criminal to be arrested on sight. The Tsarist generals availed themselves of the opportunity to prepare a counter-revolution. Their candidate for military dictator was the young General Kornilov. His colleague was the Cossack General Kalyedin, gloomy and austere patriot who shot himself 6 months later. He is discussing the plan with Rodzianko, president of the Duma. The Soviet mobilized its orators and rearmed the Workers' Guard, prepared both to argue and fight. Again, the many troops from the front marched on the capital, and again, when they got there, they joined the masses. Kerensky was implicated in the plot by the revolutionary adventurer Boris Savinkov, his contact man with Kornilov. The crowds that adored him before are now held back by soldiers and mounted police. Juggling with revolutionary power, he had completely ignored the fundamental demand of the masses: peace, bread, land. Agitation for land, bread, peace, and a Soviet government is rife in the army. In the Navy, the Bolsheviks are gaining still faster, for sailors are always more quick to revolt than soldiers. The Kronstadt sailors were the shock troops of the Bolshevik Revolution. Dubenko, the Bolshevik sailor, president of the Soviet of the Baltic Fleet. In the country, Lenin's agitators are advising the peasants to form Soviets and seize the estates of the landlords, and they are taking the advice. Released from prison in September at the demand of the workers and soldiers, Trotsky is elected president of the Soviet. Trotsky to the Soviet in early October. The bourgeois press accuses me of signing an order on the Sestroresk factory for 5,000 rifles. Yes, I signed it, and the Soviet will continue to organize and arm the workers' guard. The city is plastered with revolutionary and counter-revolutionary placards heralding the vote for the Constituent Assembly. Lenin, distrustful of parliamentary elections, is demanding an insurrection. Kerensky, afraid to move against the Soviets, assembles the military students and the women's battalion to defend the Winter Palace. Smolny Institute, the new home of the Soviets, bristles with arms and engines of war. Only cadets and the women's battalion came to the aid of Kerensky. Lacking artillery, they barricaded the palace with firewood. All Petrograd knows that Lenin has set the date for an insurrection and that Trotsky is organizing an insurrection, and moreover, they know the date. Petrograd is quiet because it is waiting for the riots to begin, but there were no riots. The government buildings were quietly occupied by disciplined detachments of armed soldiers and sailors. The Winter Palace was captured with little fighting on the night of November 7th, 1917, and the next morning, a message was broadcast to all warring governments, inviting them to discuss terms of peace, and the command issued to the army on all fronts: fraternize with the enemy. This is the beginning of the end of the World War. On the same morning, provisions were distributed to the people, and a decree was adopted abolishing without indemnity and forever the landlord's property in the Russian land. Lenin declared that the salaries of all servants of the state must be reduced to the level of a working man's wages. And it was easy to find a prime minister willing to serve on these terms. Also a commissar for foreign affairs. Ensign Krylenko became commander-in-chief of the army. As business manager of the new government, Lenin recruited his old friend Bonch-Brievich, known up to that time as an authority on the history of religion. On the same terms, a self-educated peasant, M.I. Kalinin, became president of the Workers' Republic. His principal task is to receive petitions from the workers and peasants and symbolize the change which has occurred. The first task of the new government was to negotiate a formal peace with Germany. Soviet peace delegation headed by Adolf Joffe arrives at Brest-Litovsk. Kamenev, Joffe, Karakhan, Karl Radek, and Madame Bitsenko, the first woman diplomat. Trotsky himself, as foreign minister, soon came to Brest-Litovsk to conduct the negotiations. Finding the German terms intolerable and believing Germany on the verge of revolution, he declared the war at an end but walked out, refusing to sign the peace, the only walkout of its kind in history. Immense anti-war demonstrations in Germany followed, as Trotsky had hoped. But the demonstrators were shot down. The Kaiser was still firmly in power. Guided by his generals, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, he renewed the advance against Russia. A majority of Lenin's Central Committee wanted to fight, but Lenin insisted on signing the peace, and by sheer force of will, personality, and cold reason, compelled it. His resolution and composure could not be daunted by a little thing like a treaty of peace. But the whole world was against the Soviets. On a pretext of supporting the independence of the Ukraine, the German soldiers marched into Kiev and clear across Russia to Rostov-on-the-Don. An old social revolutionary, Tchaikovsky, forming an anti-Bolshevik government at Archangel, invited Great Britain to help him. Great Britain accepted. Tchaikovsky also, through our ambassador, Francis, invited the Americans. And they accepted. The Japanese invaded Siberia with an army of 70,000 men. The Japanese battleship Hizan in the harbor of Vladivostok. Japan invited President Wilson to join her, and Wilson agreed to send a few thousand troops. The American battleship South Dakota in the harbor of Vladivostok. France, Italy, and England also sent a few thousand troops, and Vladivostok became an international war camp. So great was the variety of uniforms, flags, decorations, and complexions that it seemed, but for the bloodshed, almost like a comic opera. At the request of the Allies, 42,000 Czechoslovak war prisoners seized the Trans-Siberian Railroad and held it against the Soviets. In the south, General Denikin was organizing a volunteer army against the Soviets. On the Volga, Chernov and Avksentiev were raising a people's army against the Soviets. In Kuban, General Borgaevsky was marshaling the Cossacks against the Soviets. A year after the revolution, the Soviet government was surrounded by 14 hostile armies operating on a front 7,000 miles long. They moved their government from Petrograd to Moscow and within the walls of the Kremlin. They shot the Czar and all his family in the house in Yekaterinburg where they had been imprisoned. The death chamber The task of creating a revolutionary army was given to Leon Trotsky. By persuasion or by force, Trotsky won the services of many Tsarist officers. This is General Vasetiv. The most famous was General Brusilov. Colonel S.S. Kamenev, famous only for his mustache, became commander-in-chief. In the same month, Lênin was wounded and Uritsky shot to death by an assassin. Uritsky's funeral. Zinoviev in the center. The Red Terror followed with the Cheka, and at its head, the incorruptible Dzerzhinsky. Capitalists and landlords fled, but hundreds of thousands of workers and peasants flocked to the Red Army. The army departs for the Kazan front. Trotsky arrives at the Kazan front. The Russians love documents, but they sometimes have a difficulty in finding them. 25 days later, Trotsky congratulated his troops on the capture of Kazan. Lenin, recovering from the assassin's bullet, telegraphed Trotsky, "I greet with rapture the brilliant victory of the Red Army." The Bolshevik leaders were happy. Bukharin, Krylenko, Sokolnikov, Pyatakov, Kamenev, president of the Moscow Soviet, Sosnovsky, the feature writer of Pravda, and Christian Rakovsky, president of the Soviet Republic of the Ukraine. But a committee of Russian patriots was in Paris persuading France to take the Kaiser's place. Paul Milyukov, Kerensky himself, without flowers, now was in Paris for the same purpose. Clemenceau sent a French army into the Ukraine to help fight against the Soviets. Meanwhile, in the little city of Omsk in central Siberia, A.V. Kolchak, an admiral in the Tsar's navy, had declared himself the supreme ruler of all Russia. An expert in naval affairs, he knew little of land warfare. Admiral Kolchak is here inspecting his navy, a wood-burning gunboat on the Irtysh River in the middle of Siberia. He was a big and sick child, a pure idealist without personal ambition, but weak-willed, systemless, incapable of understanding the situation, said his colleague, Baron Budberg. Kolchak tried hard to be popular and democratic, but with very little success. Nevertheless, the anti-Bolshevik forces of the entire world pinned their hopes to the supreme ruler. The Cossacks acknowledged his supremacy. The native chiefs brought him bread, salt, and live geese in token of their friendship. And he did not know quite what to do with them. The people of Omsk turned out generously to celebrate his ascension. The priests led them to church to pray for Kolchak's triumph against the Soviets. The Allied premiers, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Wilson, and Orlando, assembled at Versailles to rearrange the world, notified Kolchak of their support against the Soviets. Kolchak's army, which is capturing Soviet soldiers by thousands. A civil war has to be ruthless, said Kolchak to his minister Ginn. I give orders to my officers to shoot all communist prisoners. Either we'll shoot them or they us. It was so in England in the Wars of the Roses. It must be so with us. The white officers stand guard while their aides remove the shoes of the Bolshevik prisoners. The red soldier laughs at death. He is still laughing. laughing. The head of a local monastery comes out at the invitation of Kolchak's officers to bless the troops and bid them Godspeed against the Soviets. Moves his navy from Omsk 500 miles down the river to Tobolsk to congratulate his victorious troops. In Moscow, starvation is fighting on Kolchak's side. Women spend all day in the surrounding country foraging for food. But Lênin, under the walls of the Kremlin, is explaining his purpose to the masses. Trotsky in his military train is flying from one front to another, exhorting and exhilarating the soldiers. The Red Army makes its stand between Kazan and the Urals. The Bolsheviks bury their martyrs with a tribute of evergreen and with armored cars bearing the motto, "Death to the enemies of the working people." After stopping Denikin in the south, the Red Army concentrated all forces to sweep Kolchak's troops out of European Russia. Kolchak's troops mine bridges as they retire. They burn whole villages where the peasants have risen against them. A Siberian village after a visit by one of Kolchak's punitive expeditions. Kolchak's troops enter a monastery looking for treasure. They dig up the old monks, but find they have already been picked over by the Bolsheviks. The Holy Father insists that they put the monks back where they belong. Kolchak's troops were driven back to Irkutsk, and he was captured and shot in prison on February 7th, 1920. The church had celebrated Kolchak's rise. A school celebrates his fall. While Kolchak's troops fled in the east, the imperial flag was unfurled in the northwest by the Tsarist general Yudenich. He was a faded and passive man, said Milyukov, concealing his limited mind and stubborn will under a mask of silence. Nevertheless, he assembled in Estonia the flower of the Tsar's armies. One officer to every 8 men. He was supplied with munitions and instruments of war by Great Britain. On October 17, 1919, Eugenich's army started for Petrograd. The Red troops fled before them, and in only 8 days they took Yamburg. In 13 days they took Gatchina and the Tsar's great palace there. In 16 days they took Tsarskoye Selo and dug in 20 miles from Petrograd. Lênin thought it might be wise to abandon the city to Eugenich, but Trotsky insisted on defending it and carried the Central Committee, military order, Red soldiers, commanders, commissars. Tomorrow decides the fate of Petrograd. We retreat no farther. All measures have been taken. The victory is prepared. Forward to the attack. Death to the hirelings of foreign capital. Long live Red Petrograd. Leon Trotsky. After the first moments of panic, Trotsky succeeded in filling the Red soldiers with enthusiasm, says Milyukov. Trotsky mobilized the entire male population of Petrograd, says a white officer. In 4 days, the Red troops were in Tsarskoye Selo. In 14 days, the Kronstadt sailors entered Gatchina and ate soup in the palace court. In 18 days, the army of Eugenich was in full flight. Pursued by soldiers, sailors, civilians, shot, shell, and propaganda. Soldiers of the army of Eugenich, read, listen, think. The Red Army does not fight against workers and peasants. Come over to our side. We will receive you like brothers. Without landlords and capitalists, czarist generals and bureaucrats, our country will live a peaceful and happy life. Death to the czarist general Eugenich. Long live workers and peasants, Russia. Leon Trotsky, President of the Military Revolutionary Soviet of the Republic. Military order. All soldiers of the army of Eugenich are dismissed from duty on receipt of this notice and ordered home. All officers resisting the execution of this order are outlawed, and every soldier is required to shoot them on the spot as enemies of the people. Military order. For all weapons delivered to any staff headquarters of the Red Army, the soldiers of Eugenich will be paid in full. Rifle 600 rubles, machine gun 2,000 rubles, cannon 15,000 rubles. Military order. Having lost working time on account of the criminal activities of Eugenich, his demobilized soldiers will retain as their recompense their accoutrement, their horse, and other property needful in peasant life. Military order. From the Executive Committee of the Communist International, I have received 5 banners for presentation to the most heroic regiments of the victorious army. Meanwhile, General Budyonny's cavalry was sweeping the remnants of Denikin's army, now commanded by Baron Wrangel, out of the Crimea. Wrangel has given the command to take to the boats. November 14th and 15th, 1920, 126 ships left the Crimea carrying 135,000 enemies of the Soviets. The world is defeated and all Russia is now a Soviet republic. The commander-in-chief takes a day off. Beside him, the staff poet, Demian Biedny. The Red Army lays down its guns and concentrates its forces on the neglected field. Lênin, President of the Republic, will not put on a necktie even to celebrate the victory. Lênin, although now far from well, is happy. Few then realized that Joseph Stalin would subsequently play the leading role. While the Bolsheviks were encircled by the world's armies, sympathizers from all countries made their way underground to Moscow to form the Communist International. Zinoviev, the president of the International, takes the chair. Clara Zetkin, the German delegate, friend of Karl Marx. The Indian Roy and the Japanese Sen Katayama. President Kalinin. The Secretary, Angelica Balabanov, Karl Radek. The Italian, Serratti. The German, Levy. The Frenchman, Rosmer. Comrade Lênin. The delegates rise to greet their leader. The American delegate, John Reed, is standing by the camera in the foreground. The delegates leave the hall after the first session. Notice among them Zinoviev, Radek, Reed. Parley P. Christensen, former Labor candidate for president, is an American guest. He towers over Lênin physically. Bill Haywood, famous leader of the IWW, is a very greatly honored guest. The delegates decorate the graves of the martyrs on Mars Field. John Reed is in front. Lênin is one of the crowd. He addresses the masses, and they greet him as their leader. Vladimir Ilyich Lênin, the genius of the Russian workers' revolution, believed by many to have been the greatest mind and character in modern history. He was free from any trace of personal greed or ambition. He devoted every working hour of his life to the cause of liberating the toiling masses of the whole world from capitalist exploitation. His mind was as flexible as his purpose was fixed. Facts, he said, are stubborn things. We must tell the workers the truth. But he never lost faith in the goal of a liberated humanity, living without war, without nationalism, without class exploitation, in friendliness and decent justice throughout the earth.